This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken begins the show for today. The pair talk about bats in Kansas, how to exclude them, and the concerns they carry. Continuing the show is K-State Assistant Professors Nellie Hill-Sullins and Logan Britton discussing what preferences Kansans have when it comes to sheep and goat meat. K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show as he says the margin level on the dairy is often measured by milk-to-feed ratios, which have been a challenge for the past few years. He takes a look at the current economics impacting the industry. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We're going to have another episode here where Drew, you're going to lead, and you're going to talk to us about some flying critters today, huh?
Yeah, we're going to talk about bats today. I looked at our website, and the bat species page, or dealing with bats, is the page that's getting the most hits right now. So I figured, let's talk about bats.
So maybe we aren't the biggest fans of bats when they're crawling around our houses, but tell us a little bit about maybe what bats do in the wild.
Yeah. So in Kansas, we've got 14 different species of bats. You know, if you look around the world or even throughout North America, there's bats that make a living doing different things. But all the bats that are in Kansas are insectivorous bats. We don't have any frugivorous bats that would eat fruit. We don't have any nectivorous bats that would be important pollinators. And we don't have any sanguinivorous bats that make their living eating blood.
Big words, you fancy guy over there. So no Dracula bats flying around.
No Dracula bats. That's right. Yeah.
Do these bats serve any major purposes? Anything beneficial about them?
Well, you know, I mentioned that all the bats that we have in Kansas are insectivorous, and that's the main purpose. If we want to think about them having a purpose other than just existing, is they eat a lot of insects. And some scientists have tried to quantify the dollar amount in services that provides. And if we just look at pest control for an agricultural standpoint, we're looking at almost $4 billion annually in terms of the benefit that they provide in offset pest control costs. So that's a big one.
Do we need to be concerned with any diseases being spread from bats to humans?
Sure. And really, if we think about human-wildlife conflicts, that's the big concern is when they get into houses, then we have this opportunity, and not just houses, but buildings in general where they could come into contact with people, then we have an opportunity for disease transmission from the bats. And there's several different things from a conflict standpoint that can cause a problem. So, you know, one of those things is just the fact that bats being in your house makes you uncomfortable. Yeah. We also get, especially if we've got a maternal colony where we've got a whole bunch of bats, we can get pretty large accumulations of feces and urine wherever they're living. It tends to be the attic or vacant space in walls and those sorts of things that bats are going to occupy, because that's most like the cavities that they would normally be in. But when we have those large accumulations of feces, we can get another fungus called histoplasma, and that histoplasma is basically kind of like a mold when it's growing on the feces, but it does produce spores that go airborne. And lots of parts of the country, most people can show antibodies to histoplasma, but if you're someone with a weakened immune system, or if you're actually like up in an attic and you're in a confined space and you breathe a whole bunch of spores from that histoplasma, then you can end up with a fungal infection in your lungs that your body can't handle, and that can become a systemic infection in your body that can be a really bad deal too.
When we're thinking about bats getting into these areas, how big of an opening do they need? They need a whole window? How big of an area can they get through?
Well, you know, if you think about a regular old pencil, that's a big enough opening for a lot of the different bat species.
Do you normally see one bat? Is it groups of bats? Do they attract other bats? How's that kind of work?
It really depends. So there's different kinds of roosts. And, you know, if we think about one of the things that I get sometimes is I'll get a call from somebody, or a text or a picture and an email from somebody that's getting a fair number of bat feces on their porch. but it's just kind of a sprinkle here and a sprinkle there. A lot of times what that'll be is what we call a night roost. And so, the bats are feeding, and while they're feeding, they're taking breaks and they're perching on things. So you could just have, a single bat that's roosting on a porch or something like that as it's stopping in between feeding bouts and those sorts of things. We can also have like a bachelor colony. So it's 1 or 2 males up to even just, maybe 4 or 5 males that are occupying an attic, but they're not reproducing. The biggest kind of colony that we might see would be a maternal colony. And so then we've got a bunch of females that are in an attic and they're producing offspring up there. They're raising those offspring in the attic. And then, they're not going to leave until those bat pups can fly. The other thing is that we could just have a bat that gets in to a house. Right? A single bat, it's an isolated instance, and that's one of those bats that's just finding an opening and getting in.
Are there other concerns? Are there other animals or other issues that might come up?
Sure. So one of the main other animal that might come up would be the parasites that bats have. What we're thinking about there is bat bugs. So bat bugs look a lot like a bed bug, and they act the same way. They feed on blood. If they get into your living space, then they're going to try and find you and bite you so that they can feed. Then there's also some soft ticks that can accumulate in a house that we have lots of bats in, and those soft ticks will come in and bite you too. Of course, the major concern that's associated with bats being in living spaces or bats being in houses is rabies. And that's one of those things that sometimes we minimize because we don't want to shed a major negative light on the species, and also because when we look at the vast majority of bats, they don't have rabies. So the big number that really ought to stand out to us is that 70% of the humans who die from rabies in the U.S. were infected by an interaction with a bat. But bats can sometimes interact with us when we're not aware of what's going on. Right? Maybe a bat ends up in a room with somebody while they're asleep, or a bat ends up in a room with a very young child or a baby, or someone who is nonverbal for another reason and either isn't aware that that bat could have been on them or may not be able to communicate to us whether that bat was on them. And rabies is 100% fatal by the time we've got symptoms. There's been 2 people in written history that have recovered from rabies after they had symptoms, and they can't figure out why those 2 sort of miracles happened. A lot of times a bite is something that we don't notice until after it becomes infected, or maybe after we start to have symptoms or something like that. And so there's a really important process that we need to think about if we could have potentially been exposed to a bat. And that is, number one, if possible, catch that bat. And that may seem undoable to some people, but you can wear heavy leather gloves, wait until that bat has perched on a solid surface, take a box, stick that box over the top of them, then slide a heavy piece of cardboard or a really heavy manila envelope underneath that box to seal it off. And then if potentially somebody could have been exposed to that bat, then go ahead and save that bat for testing. And to do that, you would reach out to your local county health department, and they would make arrangements for the testing of that bat if they determine that, yes, it should be tested. If we can't test that bat, and there's a possibility that that bat could have been on somebody, and one of those situations that I mentioned before could have occurred, then we really probably ought to get post-exposure rabies treatment. And probably ought to is not an adamant enough way to say that. The recommendation is that if somebody could have interacted with a bat and not know for sure, that they ought to get post-exposure prophylaxis if that bat can't be tested. So that's important.
The human wildlife aspect of bats is kind of scary, but they do serve a lot of purposes, really positive purposes out in nature. And so really it sounds like what we kind of need to focus on is maybe excluding them from where we're living. So what are some things we could maybe do to help us with that?
Exactly. So the main way that we control bats is through exclusion. And if you have a colony in an attic, it's almost impossible to go up there and catch all those individuals and get them out. So the main way that this is done is with what we call bat excluders or bat valves. And so this is a one-way device. There's lots of different kinds. It could just be like an onion sack kind of material that's stapled over the opening and they can get out, but they can't figure out how to get back in. Some of them are actually more like a cone that has almost a flapper valve inside of it that the bats come out, but they can't get back in. In a bachelor colony, those can be put up anytime. If we have a maternal colony, then the biology of the bat sort of comes into play when we're thinking about how to deal with this appropriately. Most companies and really all the recommendations out there about excluding bats say that we shouldn't exclude bats between July 1 and really about the middle of August, because that's that time frame when we could have flightless bats up there. Once we've had those bat valves up, once we confirm that the bats are out of the attic or whatever space that they're staying in the home, then we want to exclude them. And really that's more of a construction issue than it is a wildlife issue, which a lot of these wildlife damage issues around homes really are. But, we're going to do things like put screens up on the vents. We're going to use expanding foam or expanding caulk to seal up the cracks and crevices that they're getting in through. So this is something that folks do have some success doing on their own, but honestly, the vast majority of folks that I work with end up hiring a professional that's used to locating these entry and exit points, knows how to put the exclusionary valves up, and then also knows how to efficiently plug up and exclude those openings that they're getting in and out of. And then the final piece is cleaning up that mess, and that might be something that you also need some help with to do appropriately.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken on another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. You can listen to the full episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about sheep and goat meat preferences with Assistant Professor in Agricultural and Natural Resources Communications, Nellie Hill-Sullins, and Assistant Professor in Agricultural Economics, Logan Britton. Nellie, Logan, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
You two recently completed some research looking at Kansans' preferences for sheep and goat meat products, and why did you guys take the time to do this study?
We started this study when we saw a need among specialty livestock producers to, one, understand their market barriers. So you might remember us for talking about that study last year. But then we also wanted to approach the question from the consumer side so that we could better serve those producers with who are they marketing to? What are those consumers' preferences for specialty livestock products? And we specifically looked at sheep and goat meat because those are the most prevalent in the market at the time, and getting an understanding of how consumers are thinking about purchasing and consuming those products.
Yeah, and I think just in general, there's a lot of studies that were done in the southern part of the United States and east and west coast, and we kind of felt like there was a need of, hey, there's not really done a whole lot in the Midwest. And so we have larger data to kind of summarize other states that we're going to get hopefully published. But then, again, because we're at K-State, we want to focus on Kansans and what's going on in those market dynamics.
And as we kind of talk through today's research and look at all the different points, first wanting to talk about how often sheep and goat meat is consumed in Kansas.
Yeah, not that often. As you can see, a lot of holidays it's used, whether it's Christmas or Thanksgiving. And then surprisingly, I think Easter is like middle of the pack from our results. And so it's kind of interesting to see. But knowing that supply and demand, right? Well, there's maybe the supply is there, but not getting in the right markets and getting to the right end consumer for either retail markets, as we see, again, from our data.
Yeah, primarily our respondents to our survey are purchasing sheep and goat meat at a supermarket, more than a third from a supermarket, which was a little surprising to me as we think about that direct-to-consumer market, which was also a quarter of respondents. So those were our top two places that Kansans are looking to purchase and making those purchases when they're consuming sheep and goat meat.
What products are they usually buying?
Ground meat is the most prevalent, as you might imagine. It's a very approachable cut, and that jumped out right from the beginning that ground meat was the one that really stood out on the shelf.
As we're talking about purchasing it from a supermarket or purchasing it directly from the producer, how far are these customers willing to drive to purchase that meat?
Yeah, we see that their current drive is around 35 to 40 minutes, and then they're willing to drive further. But I think it's also very indicative of what we're seeing in Kansas, right, of whether we're in southeast Kansas or western Kansas, their next closest grocery store is kind of far away. And so I think that's some correlation that we're seeing there. But you also see a little bit of farmers markets as well from our results. But again, I think it's just very indicative of the dynamics within Kansas is in most places you're driving a little bit to get to those grocery destinations.
Since most people are buying from a supermarket, is that where they're getting their information, or where are they getting their information about these meat products?
So over a quarter of our respondents said they're not getting information about these types of products, which I think just is an opportunity to do more promotional efforts. But those that are getting information about these types of meat cuts are turning first to friends and family members, and we'll see that theme carry through our results. But they're also getting some in-store grocery promotions as well. We asked them about social media, TV, colleagues, mailed grocery advertisements, and those just weren't coming up. And I think that these aren't really surprising findings, but we see an opportunity here that maybe we could do a little bit more in our promotional efforts at the retail level to reach more consumers through those in-store grocery promotions. And then that will hopefully then have ripple effects into conversations among friends and family members.
Could that maybe also then have an impact on what the attitude is towards the meats?
Absolutely. I think that attitude plays a key role. One of our theories in ag communications is the theory of planned behavior. And in that theory, we postulate that attitudes towards the behavior, which is purchase intention of these meat products, is a key component to that purchasing behavior, as is what's called subjective norms, which is just a fancy way of saying, what do other people think about me purchasing sheep and goat meat? And then the final one is perceived behavioral control, which is just, do I have the power? Can I go to the store and find these meat cuts? If I went to a farmer's market, would I be able to identify someone who's selling these products and get them? And so we saw a really middle of the road attitude towards sheep and goat meat. And however, we saw a strong subjective norm. If it's perceived positively by my friends and family, then I'm more likely to purchase it. In fact, that was the most powerful predictor of purchasing intention was, what do I perceive how other people think of me purchasing sheep and goat meat? So that's a really powerful opportunity as we think about how we talk about sheep and goat meat, is making it a normal behavior, something that your friends and family are going to enjoy, this recipe that helps you prepare these meat cuts that you might be less familiar with. That could be an avenue for increasing consumer purchasing of these meat products.
You mentioned recipes, and is that something that maybe producers should think about when going for direct to consumer to help them understand how they could prepare that cut of meat?
Absolutely. We asked respondents about their confidence in their cooking skills, and they are really confident in their ability to follow a recipe. And they're actually fairly confident in oven baking or roasting of sheep and goat meat products. So I think let's play to their strengths and let's provide some more recipes that tie in that family and friends enjoyment component. And that will help boost their confidence in being able to prepare what might be a novel cut in their home.
Is looking at how healthy the consumer also thinks about the meat important to whether they're going to buy it or not?
Oh, for sure. I think that perception of health, and I think there's more recently been more studies showing the benefit of eating sheep and goat meat. And so I think, again, just the scalability hasn't been there. It's not been toted really well. And so I think that's a great opportunity for producers to kind of play to their strengths and say, hey, this is a nutritious product. It's just perceived maybe a little bit differently. Maybe those consumers aren't, again, really familiar with where their food comes from in the livestock sector. And so, again, showing that there is benefits of these meat products.
And I think another valuable point you guys did in this research was how much are your customers willing to pay for the meat?
Yeah, that was a really cool proponent of it. We looked at specific attributes. So we looked at sheep versus goat meat, and as well as in out-of-state products. And so we saw that consumers were willing to pay a premium for sheep meat versus goat meat, and as well as in-state products. And we've seen in the ag econ literature that that's pretty big. Is there's a lot of ethnocentricity of I want to be proud of for consuming things that are from my country or from my state, as well as I was really not shocked, but I was really surprised of the magnitude of grass-fed preference. And so I think we looked at also preparation style of kosher and halal. And so knowing that some ethnic groups in certain segments prefer those attributes because of religious reasons. And so we found that some were not statistically significant, but we saw that there's some pretty big and significant price premiums that producers can place on those products if they contain those attributes.
For those producers who are growing that sheep and goat meat, is there anything you'd like to let them know as you've taken the time to do this research?
If it's within their power and they're doing the direct to consumer marketing, to think about perhaps how they might play to that. It's a common behavior. Your friends, your family are consuming this meat, or they're going to enjoy this meat product. And maybe here's a recipe to help you, wow them at the dinner table, could be a way to take your marketing efforts that would have an immense impact on their predictive intention to purchase more of those meat products. I think the combination of those results could be an opportunity for producers to experiment a little bit with their marketing efforts and see if that makes a difference in some of those purchasing behaviors.
Yeah, I think to add to that just a little bit, I think Nellie hit the nail on the head there, but knowing that peer effect is going to be pretty big. And so whether those producers reach to their networks and to continue, I know from my personal experience, I really didn't consume a lot of lamb and goat. But for every Easter, my in-laws will have leg of lamb. And so now it's a staple in our family. So we'll have lamb every now and then now because I'm now more open to the taste of it. And so, again, I think copy and paste that into other families and other households within the state of Kansas.
If people are wanting to find out and read this publication or find more information, how can they do that?
Yeah, they can go to the agmanager.info website, as well as reaching out to Nellie or myself. We have, a larger data set that encompass, I think, Missouri, Nebraska, Colorado, Oklahoma, and the Panhandle of Texas was our specific region that we're looking at. And so if anybody wants to know more about those specific states, they can definitely reach out to either one of us.
Logan, Nellie, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was Assistant Professor in Agricultural and Natural Resources Communications, Nellie Hill-Sullins, and Assistant Professor in Agricultural Economics, Logan Britton. I will link this publication in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Dairy producers are always looking for ways to increase profit margins. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says the margin level on the dairy is often measured by milk-to-feed price ratios, which have been a challenge the past few years. This week, Mike takes a closer look at the economics impacting the industry.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some of the things we're seeing in economics in our dairy industry. As we think about the economics on our dairy farms, there are some things that may be concerning to you in your operation. One of those might be the overall margin level on your dairy. One of the ways that we often measure how we're doing in terms of economics on our dairy farms is the milk-to-feed price ratios. And as we look at those ratios, they've been a real challenge, especially the last few years. Even though we had a record milk price in 2022, the actual return on our dairies was not that great due to increased feed prices. We saw low margins on the milk-to-feed ratio in 2023, and that's continued into 2024. Although recently that is starting to turn around and look a little more positive for us. We look at what happened in 2023, we only averaged a ratio of about 1.67, which is very low. And currently we're above 2, but not too far above 2 on that ratio, although it is increasing. As we look into the rest of 2024 and into 2025, we may see an increase in that milk-to-feed ratio due to the fact that feed costs may actually continue to decrease as we look at what's going on in the corn and the soybean markets, and realizing that we may have a very nice crop out in the field. So if that is harvested along with the carryover corn and soybeans that we have in the marketplace, that may help keep feed prices down and actually reduce them from the level that they're at the current time. Are we going to see much of an increase in the price of milk? Well, there may be some increases there, but I think that our largest advantage here on milk-to-feed price ratios will be found in decreased feed costs. Now, as we look at some of the other costs across the dairy industry, we also see some significant changes there. Recently, the Milk Market Administrator and Central Order published some data looking at what has happened since 2011 going through 2023. And as we look at some of those data points, one of the important ones probably to look at would be the cost of production, interest, taxes, and wages. As we look at those four categories, and if we use 2011 as equal to 100 or the base, we see in 2022 and 2023, those indices rose to 139 and 141, what they had been in 2011. So as we look at these things on our dairy farms and we look at our bottom lines, obviously the increase in our production cost as well as wage rates has had a negative impact on our bottom line. When I look at some of the other factors that affect the value of your bottom line on your dairy, one of the things that we often look at is replacement cow cost. And as we look at what's going on in the heifer market today compared to where we were at just a few years ago, heifers have risen significantly. So how do you utilize this information on your dairy farm? Well, number one, as we look at returns are based on level of milk production as well as cost of production and the value that we get for the commodities that we're selling. One of the things that you can control on your dairy is level of production as you work with your dairy herd and try to make improvements to increase the amount of milk that you actually ship off your dairy farm or the amount of milk that you ship per cow on the dairy. We know that certain production costs will continue to be a challenge. Trying to reduce labor costs is going to be probably difficult unless we can somehow offset increases in labor costs with increases in milk production to cover those increased costs. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to carefully consider their bottom line, where it is at, and what factors they can control to increase that bottom line in the future.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.